Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This episode is going to start out a little differently than usual, because before we can get to the dialogue whose translation I'll be analyzing, I need to take one specific step that I thought I should explain. Remember that fishman intoning curses against Bergenworth who we met after walking through the Astral Clock Tower? Well, he'll give you both a special dialogue and a unique item if you happen to talk to him with the Milkweed rune equipped. So I'm going to put that on now and not worry too much about how it turns my head into something that looks like cauliflower. Also, while I head back to speak to that villager, I want to reiterate what I said about this rune in Translationborne 82, which is that it symbolizes our willingness to take on a nurturing role and provide sustenance to spirits or phantasms. I believe it's the demonstration of our commitment to this way of being that explains why equipping this rune unlocks new dialogue.
Curse here, curse there. A curse for he and she. White hair. A bottomless curse. A bottomless sea. Source of all greatness. All things that be. Listen for the baneful chants. Weep with them as one in trance. And weep with us. Oh, weep with us.
Are you weeping though? Because I just hear a lot of cursing.
Listen for the baneful chants. A call to the bloodless wherever they be. A call to the bloodless wherever they be. Fix your ears to hear our calls.
See? A lot of cursing and a bad cough. On a more serious note though, I actually like how the official translation does find a way to subtly emphasize this person's grief. Intriguingly, the setup for this comes in what may be an unrelated decision, which is the choice to make each pair of lines in the first dialogue rhyme. The Japanese lines don't do this, but rhyming is generally less of a notable feature in that language to begin with. As to why the translators would use a rhyme scheme here, I suspect the reason is that it allows them to quote what was likely an existing translation for the second line of the Japanese. This sentence is part of two much longer chants that can sort of be made out in the background of the Hunter's Nightmare. Chants that we've heard a portion of once before, when we were first teleported in. Anyway, in the context of a chant, the decision to make the line rhyme in English is more obvious, because it properly conveys the idea of a ritualized pronouncement. So my theory is that when the translators put in that quoted bit of dialogue, they decided to use the rhymed form of a chant all the way through, so that one part wouldn't stand out. As a result, they get the added bonus of suggesting that the one line that doesn't continue into a rhyme ends because the speaker is too overcome by grief to continue. And we're going to get a sense of what that grief is for in this cutscene, as we watch the post-mortem birth of what appears to be a Great One's child. Rather than focus on that right now, though, I want to spend a little more time going over the first of that villager's lines, because I'm left somewhat perplexed at how it was rendered into English. In the official translation, it sounds as if the speaker is willing to curse anyone and everyone with abandon. Looking at the Japanese, though, I would think a better translation for noro mono would be one who curses. Ordinarily, noro, which means to curse, would combine with mono for person in the active sense of a person who is cursing someone else. If understood in this way, it sounds as if the speaker is saying however many people are doing the cursing, it will never be enough. This is potentially significant, because understood in that way, it could be taken as an invitation to join in the cursing. This idea would then be reinforced by the presentation of the Accursed Brew at the end of this dialogue, because as we'll see, that item allows players to hurl curses at foes. To be fair, the official translation could still convey this idea, with a curse for he and she why care, referring to people taking ownership of the act of pronouncing curses, but that's not how I would normally interpret that phrasing. Alternatively, it could be that the Japanese noro mono is meant to be understood as the speaker narrating what he's doing with the subject of the sentence dropped. Taken this way, a literal translation would be closer to one who I curse, which better fits the more straightforward understanding of the official English. Also, the presentation of the Accursed Brew in and of itself doesn't necessarily reinforce one interpretation over another, because an item that's meant for tossing around curses still fits what I find to be the straightforward understanding of the official English translation. Nor does it help that there's another extremely ambiguous phrase at the start of the third line of the Japanese. Literally, sa jusou consists of the word sa, which can either be an informal exhortation or a form of mumbling, the word jusou, which means curse, and the direct object marker wo. In other words, there's no subject and no verb. As a result, this line could be taken as another invitation to join in the cursing, or it could be just as the official translation has it, a call to listen to the baneful chants. I bring this up because I think it helps show how in these circumstances, the ideal thing to do is ask for clarification. That's not always an option, but in this case, hopefully the collaborative process for the voiced lines means the translators were able to do that. Now that we've reached phase 2 of this fight though, I think it's time to discuss an important aspect of the name of the boss I'm facing, which I might literally render Kos's dying child. Well, okay, there's actually a good amount of interpretation that I've put into that particular formulation. Setting aside the change from Gosu to Kos, which I've covered in another episode, if you just look up the word ishi using the relevant kanji in a Japanese to English dictionary, you'll get a result for orphan. The thing is, that specific word choice is an archaic one in Japanese. More up to date is the term iji, which similarly starts with the kanji for bequeath, though it ends with the kanji for infant rather than child. Still more common is the word koji, which also means orphan, and which shows up in the first part of the term for orphanage, as we can see from the orphanage key in Bloodborne. So why would the Japanese term for this boss use such an unusual version of the word orphan? Well, I can't say for certain, but I suspect it's because the pronunciation of the term ishi matches that in the phrase chi no ishi, or dying will of blood, which has officially been translated as blood echoes. This is why I decided on the term Kos's dying child, to suggest a similar parallel to the literal dying will of blood. That connection is only strengthened by how both concepts begin with the same kanji in Japanese. The one that I mentioned earlier means bequeath. Granted, that applies to the more modern term iji as well, but of course its pronunciation isn't the same. Anyway, the effect of this archaic word choice is to suggest a connection between the two concepts. In the one case, we have blood harboring the will of the slain, and in the other, we have a child that represents the legacy of its dead mother. Though perhaps I should have used the past tense. But either way, this is the sort of wordplay in the original that it's nigh impossible to bring over to the English, even if the translators were able to catch it. Remember, this is DLC, so blood echoes is a term set in stone. That means that even setting aside the potential confusion about the child being the one that's dying, the phrasing of Kos's dying child wouldn't make sense. Meanwhile, going with the analogous Echo of Kos would also be less than ideal, because players might not understand that the boss was in fact Kos's orphaned child. Or at least, the lingering spirit of Kos's orphaned child. That's what I think the shadowy figure of the boss I dispelled with an attack was meant to represent. Note that it was only with that spirit's dissipation that we got the message about having hunted the nightmare. Anyway, as much as I like the Japanese connection between the orphaned child and the lingering will of Kos, the translators probably had to let that double meaning go, much like that odd shadow.
Ah, sweet child of Kos, returned to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be.
Well, that sounds cryptic, but vaguely positive, so I guess that's nice. More importantly from a translation perspective, though, it should sound familiar. That's because roughly the first 3/4 of this line in Japanese are an exact repeat of something that villager said when we spoke to him with the milkweed rune equipped. You can see this in the structure of my literal versions too, with both instances opening curses and the sea are bottomless, therefore all. This resemblance didn't escape the official translators either, as we can see from their more poetic approach. What's more, I would argue that the decision to make these lines rhyme in English actually enhances the similarity between these two translations. By using the same rhyme between C and B in both instances, the repetition becomes even more recognizable than if they had simply made these two lines start the same way, like in the Japanese. And I bring this up because I believe this reuse of language is in part meant to create a linguistic metaphor when considering these lines side by side. If we look at the parts of these phrases that are different, we can see that a big part of the first one we hear is a claim that all things come towards us from the ocean. Admittedly, this is a little easier to see in the Japanese, where the kuru in yatte kuru makes it clear that the idea is that all things come to us from the sea, but I think the official English source works well enough in this regard too. In any case, the unique portion of the second line expresses basically the opposite idea, saying that the ocean can take everything into itself. Now, if it were just these statements alone, they might end up feeling contradictory, but I think the repeated phrasing helps ground us and gives us the idea that these opposite truths are in fact complementary. In other words, the overall effect is a sense that the sea gives and the sea takes away. It's almost like tides coming in and out, or waves spreading out over the shore and then drawing away, with the repetitive yet distinct pattern of words and meanings serving as a metaphor for this same set of motions. I think this is extremely cool, and I admire the way the translators have not just recreated the effect, but made each line work separately. In particular, I like the final narration, because it suggests that the bottomless nature of the sea is what allows it to accept a bottomless curse, reinforcing our understanding of the effect of large bodies of water in Bloodborne, while also using the lines as a send-off to the Orphan of Kos. Speaking of that boss and the curse of this nightmare though, I want to re-examine that fishman's ravings for new meaning now that we have more context. For instance, remember how he was calling for the pungence of Kos to cling like a mother's devotion? Well, having watched the opening cutscene for the boss fight, I think it's easier to see how that wish might make sense for the orphan still inside the body of its dead mother. This also helps explain the reference to blasphemy, but it doesn't tell us why the label of mass murderer would be used in Japanese. For that, we'll have to turn to this next item. Curse receptacle. The skull of a resident of the violated fishing village. Most likely, the inside of the skull was searched for eyes. Countless remnants of terrible treatment exist. That is precisely why the skull became a receptacle for curses. Cursing ones, oh please, wail and sob together with them. So, from a lore perspective, we can see right in the first Japanese line that the fishing village was forcibly infringed upon. The verb in question, jurien suru, is in the passive voice, but based on the other information we picked up, it's pretty clear that Bergenworth and some old hunters are the ones who took action, including people who would be associated with the Healing Church. After all, the final DLC location is a carefully guarded church secret. Anyway, when these forces attacked the fishing hamlet, it's likely many of the people who lived there were killed in the process. This is suggested not only by the existence of the skull, but also by the search for eyes inside it, since it seems unlikely that only one such victim would be examined in this way. This is probably enough to account for why the first villager we see calls the attackers mass murderers in Japanese. It may also be why Simon tells us that the village itself is the secret that gave rise to the hunter's nightmare, because it was the hunter's actions throughout the village and not just on the beach that were so awful. But as interesting as this item is for the game's lore, I think it's even more fascinating to examine in terms of its translation. For one thing, consider how the official English presents the skull being searched for internal eyes. In Japanese, there are two ways the first of the corresponding lines of text is marked as containing assured speculation. First, it opens with the phrase osoraku wa, which indicates a likely conjecture that tends to be associated with an unfortunate or negative truth. And second, it ends with daro, which is commonly employed for suppositions. The result is that the statement that the skull was searched for internal eyes is flagged in the Japanese as a kind of theory of an unfortunate truth. In this context, the statement that countless traces or scars of harsh treatment exist inside the skull sounds a lot like the basis for the preceding statement. Indeed, the translators seem to have taken it this way, because if we look back at the English, it begins with a claim that the skull was searched for eyes on the inside that is then substantiated with what the remnants of such a search would consist of. If you ask me, it's really that final interpretive leap from the literal lingering marks of severe treatment to scratches and indentations that's the most striking aspect of these two lines. However, when you consider what sort of evidence would lead to the conclusion that the skull had been probed internally, I think you can see how even this makes sense. Furthermore, if you consider that the translators used the word forcibly when describing how the skull was searched for eyes, I think the general idea of harsh treatment ends up coming across to an English speaker, even if it's not presented the same way as it is in Japanese. Of course, these lines aren't the only parts of this item description that require interpretation to be understood in translation. There's also the term Tamari to consider, which is especially important because it forms part of the item name. This word's primary definition involves a pool or collection of something, though the term also has several other definitions. These include a place where people gather, a waiting area for sumo wrestlers, the liquid runoff from miso preparation, and a variety of rich soy sauce. So, to get a sense for which definitions apply, let's look at the surrounding context. In the case of the item name, the term is being paired with the word juso, which means curse, and the same pairing of ideas comes up again in the fourth line of the Japanese item description. The idea seems to be that because of the terrible history behind this skull, curses have come to gather or pool within it. The question is, how should this be expressed in English? When it comes to my own versions, I decided to emphasize the idea that the skull acts as a place that's ideal for curses to accumulate, sort of based on an analogy to the second definition of a spot where people meet up, and so I used the word receptacle in both cases. The official translation, on the other hand, emphasizes the metaphor of pooled liquid in two slightly different ways. For the item name, the phrase Accursed Brew gets at the idea of a potent concoction of curses, whereas in the description, the skull is said to be stewed in curses. Either way, the trick with this term is there isn't really an equivalent word in English to take the place of tamari, which means that some interpretation has to be done. Personally, I like how the translators have managed to keep that liquid connection, and I find the thought of reaching into my accursed brew to hurl curses at my foes more exciting than tossing a curse from my curse receptacle. To be fair, I could see an argument that the concept of an accursed brew is a bit too abstract for an item name, but I'd still say it works at conveying the right idea from the Japanese. Whatever you make of that, though, there's still one more aspect of this description to consider, because the final line is another sort of callback. It's a combination of two different things we've heard in dialogue form in a new context, and as I bring this episode to a close, I want to point out how this contrasts with something we saw at the start of the episode. Remember how I said noromono would normally be used to get at the idea of someone performing a curse? Well, in the case of the Accursed Brew, the official translation is fully in line with that sense of the term, speaking of they who offer baneful chance. Now, I think this works perfectly, both in terms of my interpretation of these lines at the end of this item description, and in terms of using a rhyme to draw players' attention to the phrase, but it does leave me wondering about the reasoning behind why it was translated differently before. Of course, if you have any thoughts on that, or any other aspect of the episode, I'd be happy to hear from you. Your feedback is always appreciated. Also, remember that if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.